Yeah, these two are basically the same filmmaker. Alright, maybe that's a bit hyperbolic. See, one of them likes to tell stories about dysfunctional families, alienation, surrogate families, regret, loneliness, and the other likes to tell stories about. Okay, I get it. At first glance, comparing Steven Spielberg to Paul Thomas Anderson seems like comparing a golden retriever to a brooding cat. But at second glance, it also doesn't make sense. But at third glance, okay, maybe you need to stop glancing and look deeper into the themes that these two filmmakers like to talk about. I mean, sure, Spielberg is the perennial optimist, and he built his entire empire on awestruck faces and soaring John Williams scores, while Paul Thomas Anderson crafts intimate character studies that feel like emotional ambushes sometimes. But come here, a little closer. You look really deep, and you'll see that these two are basically the same filmmaker. Okay, I won't be so hyperbolic. They are two halves of the same coin. They're both obsessed with dysfunctional families, alienation, loneliness, and the ghost of the past. The only difference is the way that they approach the storytelling. Even still, the thematic parallels between these two filmmakers are undeniable. Spielberg approaches these topics with a childlike wonder, while Anderson filters his through guarded emotion. Still, even with Anderson's reputation as the cooler, moodier sibling in this scenario, when you consider films like Boogie Nights and Licorice Pizza, they kind of hum with a sense of Spielbergian hope and connection. Anderson just likes to put you through the ringer to get you to that hope sometimes. I think a great example of their similarities is the similarities between Indiana Jones and Frank T.J. Mackey from Magnolia. Sounds crazy, but hear me out. They share a surprising commonality in how the relationships with their fathers deeply influence their identities, shaping their strengths and emotional vulnerabilities. Indiana Jones's relationship with his father, Henry Jones Sr., is marked by emotional distance. Henry's obsession with the Holy Grail and academic pursuits left Indy feeling neglected during his formative years. The strained relationship manifests in Indy's need to prove himself through his own adventures and scholarly achievements, often rejecting his father's approach to life. In The Last Crusade, their journey together brings these issues to the forefront, highlighting how Indy's boldness and skepticism are reactions to his father's more restrained and devout demeanor. On the other hand, Frank T.J. Mackey's father, Earl Partridge, abandoned him and his dying mother when Frank was only a teenager, forcing him to grow up fast and fend for himself emotionally and financially. This abandonment fuels Frank's transformation into a toxic, hypermasculine self-help guru who teaches men to surpass their vulnerabilities, which is a reflection of his unresolved anger towards his father. When confronted with his father's impending death, Frank's emotional facade crumbles, revealing a depth of his pain and longing for recognition. Both of these characters' relationship with their fathers define their ambition and success. And in the end, they both have resolutions. It's just one is slightly more optimistic and one is more pessimistic. Both Paul Thomas Anderson and Steven Spielberg famously have had issues with their families growing up, specifically with their fathers. For a long time, Spielberg blamed his father for the divorce of his parents. Meanwhile, Paul Thomas Anderson had a very complicated relationship with his father, and it's really on display in Magnolia. Again, they tackle the same subject matter in their own different ways. Isolation is another key theme in their films. In E.T., Elliot is a lonely boy struggling with the absence of his father and alienation of his childhood. In Punch Drunk Love, Barry is an emotionally stunted and isolated man battling his insecurities and anger. Both of them find unlikely relationships that lift them out of their loneliness and isolation. Both films focus on characters who are emotionally vulnerable and yearning for connection. Both filmmakers just explore these universal themes in completely different ways. For instance, dysfunctional families are Spielberg's bread and butter. Think E.T., where a lonely kid in a fractured home befriends a lost alien and finds healing through connection. It's a masterclass in Spielberg's ability to make even the most dysfunctional situation feel magical. Spielberg's characters stumble through the wreckage but always find love at the end of the rainbow. Now, Paul Thomas Anderson doesn't like to hand out warm hugs as easily. In Magnolia, for instance, you have a web of broken families so tangled up that it makes a soap opera look like a children's book. There's abuse, loneliness, estrangement, regret. Some of Spielberg's main themes, but like with fewer bike rides across the moon and more existential dread. Yet in both cases, there's an undercurrent of longing for repair. Spielberg will often give you a happy ending, while Paul Thomas Anderson will often leave it ambiguous enough for us to decide how it goes ourselves. At the end of the day, Spielberg and PTA, yeah, I rhymed, are tackling the same big questions about family, loneliness, and human connection. Spielberg invites us to believe in the transformative power of love and forgiveness, often with a swelling score and a twinkle in the eye. Paul Thomas Anderson don't do that. Together, they're two halves of the same emotional coin, proving that wonder and restraint are just different ways of exploring the same truths about being a human. That doesn't mean that Paul Thomas Anderson isn't capable of optimism, though. I think Catch Me If You Can and Boogie Nights is a great example of two optimistic views of redemption. For Frank, redemption comes in the form of Carl Hanratty, the FBI agent who transitions from pursuer to mentor. Eventually, the relationship between Frank and Carl evolves into that of a father and a son, filling the void left by Frank's fractured family. Dirk's redemption in Boogie Nights is quieter but no less impactful. After a spiral of bad decisions, drug addiction, crime, and isolation, Dirk returns to Jack Horner's home seeking forgiveness and reconciliation with his surrogate family. Anderson doesn't wrap things up as neatly as Spielberg does, but when you look at Boogie Nights, it's a very hopeful ending. And that's the thing. Paul Thomas Anderson, with his darker emotional palette, isn't necessarily afraid of optimism. And Spielberg can also be pretty dark and emotionally guarded sometimes too. Check out a film like Munich. Munich and Schindler's List are complex and morally ambiguous works that aren't afraid to stare into the abyss. But even in Spielberg's darkest works, there's hope, and even in Anderson's most hopeful works, there's a little bit of darkness. Like, if you really look at Licorice Pizza and really think about Alana and Gary's relationship, it's doomed to fail. They are the dark side and the light side of the exact same emotions, the optimistic and pessimistic view of the same thing. There's no better picture of this optimistic and pessimistic view of the same thing than with Oskar Schindler and Daniel Plainview. Oskar Schindler is looking for acceptance and literally trying to buy himself into this world to be looked at with respect. Daniel Plainview, on the other hand, is isolated in a completely different way, letting his ambitions keep him from human connection. Both of these characters fail to connect with other people throughout the film, mainly because of the ambition that they have. However, where they deviate is where these two characters land. Schindler's List has a more optimistic view of redemption for Oskar Schindler, whereas when handed the opportunity for redemption, Daniel Plainview rejects it and becomes even more isolated than ever before. If you boil it down though, both directors are obsessed with alienation. Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind is the ultimate I'm done with this world, I'm off to find aliens movie. Roy Neary abandons his home, his family, and all of that stuff to essentially touch the stars. And in doing so, he finds himself. Surrogate families are Spielberg's safe place, healing wounds with the glow of a celestial light. Meanwhile, Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights is also about finding a family, though it swapped spaceships for the 1970s adult film industry. Dirk Diggler comes from a neglectful home and finds his surrogate family in Jack Horner's film crew. Alright, it's a little dysfunctional, but at its heart, it's about longing and belonging, much like E.T. But then you have Licorice Pizza and The Fabelmans, which both strike similar nostalgic tones. In Licorice Pizza, Alana and Gary form their own odd little world, navigating the mess of adolescence and young adulthood while leaning on each other. The vibe of this film is pure Spielbergian, a nostalgic rose-tinted view of the relationships and friendships that save us. Going back to The Fabelmans, it does something similar, using nostalgia to show how rough it is growing up and becoming yourself, looking at the hardships of loneliness and finding where you belong. Look, they may not be the exact same filmmaker, but they are an interesting study about how two different people can attack the same emotional topics. And they are the same. If you look at their films, they tackle literally these same themes throughout all of them. One just does it with a little more hope, and one does it with a little more pessimism. Every coin has two sides, and these two are a perfect example of that.